I was in Nairobi during the water riots of 2036. I was in Jakarta when the sea wall collapsed and 11,000 people lost their homes in one afternoon. I've stood in places where the air smelled like burning things I didn't want to identify, and I've kept my camera up and my hands steady, because that's what you do when you're trying to tell the truth about the world. I thought I had seen the worst and the best that human beings were capable of. I had never seen anything like what happened in the plaza that day. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever fully get over it. Not because it was terrible. It wasn't terrible, not in the end. But there are moments in a life that split time in half, before and after. That day was one of those moments for me, and I think it was for a lot of people who were standing there. You could feel it. You could feel the world tilting under your feet, and it wasn't the ground that was moving. It was everything you'd ever assumed about the universe. I had my camera, I got the shot. But when I look at that photo now, the one that ended up on every front page, the one they used for the congressional inquiry cover, I don't see what everyone else sees when they look at it. They see the alien. I see Sergeant Delaney's face. That's the story. That's always been the story. Segment 2, Setup. The world as it was that morning. Official briefing document. Interplanetary Diplomatic Liaison Office. Internal record, April 14, 2041, 06:00 hours EST. Classification. Amber, released to Congressional Review Board per Executive Order 1194. Subject, Day 12 of the Galactic Compact Integration Ceremonies. Security and Protocol Overview. The Grand Integration Plaza, formerly the National Mall grounds, had been undergoing structural and aesthetic renovation for the past 14 months in preparation for the integration ceremonies. The ceremonies represented humanity's formal transition from observed status, a classification assigned by the Galactic Compact Council approximately 9 years prior, following our detection of the Fermi signal broadcast, to provisional member status, a designation that came with certain privileges and, more importantly, certain responsibilities. The attending compact delegation consisted of 7 species. For ease of reference, and in accordance with the public naming conventions approved by the State Department Communication Office, these species had been assigned simplified common names for civilian use. Full scientific designations appear in Appendix C. Attending species. The very tall, pale gray bipeds, 7 to 8 feet bilateral symmetry, considered the elder diplomatic species of the compact. The Neurosi, 4-limbed, dense-framed, violet pigmented, analogous in social structure to what humans might call a military culture. The Chel, small, wide-eyed, extraordinarily fast-moving, often described in early contact reports as resembling large deep-sea creatures that had learned to walk. The Dremish, translucent, gaseous in lower atmospheric pressure. Traveling in sealed environment suits. The Sala, humanoid in proportion, golden-brown integument, considered by multiple human sociologists to be the easiest for human crowds to process visually. The HFY, insectoid, 6-limbed, compound-eyed. The most recently joined compact species. And the Neurosi military escort contingent, 12 soldiers accompanying the primary Neurosi diplomatic party. The Neurosi military escort was the element that had drawn the most attention from our own security planning teams in the weeks prior to the ceremonies. They were not analogous to ceremonial soldiers in the human sense. The Neurosi do not have a tradition of symbolic military display. Their soldiers are combat-ready at all times, psychologically and physically, and their presence at a diplomatic event carries the same weight as a fully armed and active military deployment. Their escort function is not decorative, it is operational. This distinction was noted repeatedly in the pre-ceremony risk assessments. It was also, in the estimation of several senior security advisors, insufficiently communicated to the civilian public. Recorded statement, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, USMC Personal Testimony, Congressional Review Board, Session 7. I've been asked to explain what it felt like to stand that post. I'll do my best. You have to understand, there was no manual for this. I mean that literally. We had briefing packets, we had the liaison protocols, we had the rules of engagement document that was about 68 pages long and had been rewritten 4 times in the past 6 months because nobody could quite agree on what use of force meant when you were talking about an alien soldier who could bench press a school bus. We had all of that, and it still felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark and being told to hold the line. The plaza that morning was something. The renovation people had done a real job. There were these white stone pathways, new ones, wide enough for the Verk to walk comfortably. There were translation pylons every 40 feet, these tall blue-lit columns that emitted the translation field. The compact had provided the core technology. Our people had integrated the human language output, and the whole system was designed to render verbal communication between species in roughly real time. Roughly. There's a 3-second lag on complex syntactical structures, and emotions don't always translate with the same weight they carry in the original. That 3-second lag mattered later. The crowd, civilians, permitted attendees, press, invited dignitaries, was positioned behind a series of low barriers along the outer edges of the central pathway. Maybe 3,000 people total in the immediate plaza area, another several 100,000 watching on live broadcast. The barriers weren't high. They weren't meant to contain a riot. They were meant to define a boundary, a symbolic one. We had been told repeatedly that symbolic was sufficient. The Verk delegation had made a specific request that the human security presence not appear aggressive. No weapons visible. No combat posture. We were to stand at parade rest, and we were to remain stationary unless a situation arose that required us to move. I had 12 Marines on the central pathway, good people, every single one of them. I was stationed at the midpoint of the pathway, roughly 40 feet from where the Neurosi military escort had taken up their own formation. They were standing in a 2x6 arrangement, 12 soldiers, wearing what our analysts had designated Class IV field armor, dull dark material, somewhere between midnight blue and black, that absorbed light in a way that made them look slightly less real than everything around them, like cutouts in the air. They didn't move. They barely seemed to breathe. Their eyes, compound, slightly amber, tracked everything without any visible reaction. I've stood a lot of posts in a lot of places. I've done embassy duty. I've done close protection. I've stood outside forward operating bases in the dark knowing there were unfriendly people in the hills. Nothing felt like standing 40 feet from 12 Neurosi soldiers, while 3,000 civilians tried to figure out whether they were allowed to take photos. Recorded statement, Corporal Janine Park, USMC, personal testimony. The energy in the crowd it was strange. Not bad exactly. It wasn't fearful, or it was fearful in the way that a roller coaster is fearful, you know. That anticipatory kind of fear that's also excitement because you chose to be there. People had applied for years for permits to attend these ceremonies. This was once in a lifetime. The Verk delegation had arrived first. That part went smoothly. They moved with this extraordinary slowness and deliberateness, like watching something move in a different gravity, and there was this collective intake of breath from the crowd when they came down the central pathway. They were just tall, so tall, and the translation pylons were making this low harmonic sound that our briefings had told us was the Verk equivalent of a processional tone, their version of a national anthem, and a few people in the crowd started to cry. I understood that. I felt something too, something in the chest behind the sternum, like the moment when music hits you unexpectedly and your body reacts before your brain does. The solid delegation came next, and the crowd responded more openly to them because they were proportioned the most like us. There was some applause, which the liaison team had said was appropriate and welcome. The solid delegate, the one they called Ambassador Tiras in the press materials, actually raised a hand in what our teams had confirmed was their version of acknowledgement, a greeting gesture. The crowd reacted like he'd just done something miraculous. People laughed and cried and cheered all at once. I remember looking over at Sergeant Delaney at that point. He was watching the crowd. Not the sala, not the dignitaries, the crowd. That was the first time I really paid attention to him that day, because that was exactly the right thing to be doing, and it was the first time I'd seen anyone other than Sergeant Webb doing it. Everyone else, civilians and most of the junior detail, was watching the spectacle. Sergeant Delaney was watching the people. I made a note of that. Segment 3, Introducing the Principal. Personal Account, Staff Sergeant Raymond Delaney, USMC, submitted in writing to the Congressional Review Board at the board's request, dated April 29, 2041. I want to be clear about something before I start. I'm not a hero. I'm not interested in being a hero, and I'm not interested in the word being applied to what I did that afternoon. I've met heroes, real ones. They don't call themselves that. They just did the thing that was in front of them to do, and then they went home and tried to eat dinner and not think about it too much. That's all I did. I did the thing that was in front of me. I'm going to try to describe the day as I experienced it, from my station on the Central Pathway, without embellishment, and without any of the narrative framing that I've seen applied to the footage in the media coverage since. Some of those narratives are complementary. Some of them feel like they're describing someone else. Both versions make me equally uncomfortable. Here is what I experienced. Morning briefing was at 500. Standard pre-ceremony brief, covering delegation schedule, translation pylon protocols, rules of engagement summary, and the specific cultural advisory packet on the Neurosi military escort. This was the fourth time most of us had been briefed on the Neurosi. The briefings were thorough. What they couldn't do was make you feel it in a room, the way you feel it when you're actually standing 40 feet away from them. The advisory packet said several things about the Neurosi that I want to put in this account, because I think they're important for understanding what happened. First, the Neurosi do not have a concept of theatrical aggression. Their military culture has no equivalent of a bluff, a posture, or a display. This is critical. What humans might read as an aggressive pose or an aggressive movement is, for the Neurosi, never a pose. They do not escalate by appearance. They de-escalate or they engage. There is no middle. This means their body language gives almost no warning before action. Not because they are unpredictable, within their own framework, they are extremely consistent, but because the behavioral stage we rely on in human-to-human threat assessment simply does not exist for them. Second, the Neurosi have a hierarchical structure built around what the cultural analysts called space sovereignty. Their soldiers maintain a defined perimeter around the primary diplomatic party at all times, and that perimeter is considered, within Neurosi law, to be a sovereign extension of the diplomatic delegation. Anyone who enters that perimeter uninvited has, by Neurosi standards, committed an act equivalent to trespassing on sovereign military ground. The response to such a trespass is physical removal, and physical removal by Neurosi standards is forceful. The advisory packet included the phrase, "Do not expect a verbal warning." That phrase was in every briefing. Third, and this is the one that I kept coming back to, standing there watching the crowd, the Neurosi emotional register is the inverse of ours in one specific way. In humans, emotional response typically becomes more volatile as stress increases. We shout, we move faster, we become louder. In the Neurosi, emotional stress produces stillness. Their version of rage looks to human eyes like absolute calm. Their version of absolute calm looks, to human eyes, like they're about to do something terrible. There is no reliable external indicator, from a human observer's perspective, of where a Neurosi soldier is on the emotional spectrum at any given moment. I had read all of this. I understood all of this. I was standing at my post, watching the crowd, watching the delegation pathway, running these parameters through my head on rotation, the way you do when you've been briefed so thoroughly that the information has become a kind of background hum. The Sala delegation finished their processional approach. The dignitaries on the ceremonial platform were being introduced by the IDLO Secretary General. There was going to be a short address, a symbolic exchange of what the Werk called covenant tokens, artifacts that had been prepared by both sides representing the terms of the provisional membership agreement, and then a reception period during which the barriers along the pathway would be adjusted to allow limited and supervised civilian approach to the delegations. We were about 20 minutes from the token exchange when I noticed the man. Recorded statement, Delilah Osaibansu continued. I saw him before Sergeant Delaney did, actually, because I had a sightline to that section of the crowd, from where I was positioned about 60 feet to the north. He was, I don't know how to describe him without sounding judgmental, and I want to be fair. He was excited. Genuinely, overwhelmingly, childishly excited, and in a different context that would have been completely fine. He was maybe 55 years old, wearing one of those commemorative integration ceremony jackets they'd been selling outside the plaza for weeks, the kind with the compact logo on the sleeve. He had a camera, an actual camera, a good one, and he'd been pushing slowly toward the front of the crowd from the moment the Sala delegation appeared. By the time the Secretary General started his address, this man was at the very front edge of the barrier in Section D, which was directly adjacent to the Neurosi military escort formation. The barriers were low, I've said that. They were symbolic. They were about waist height on an average adult. This man was leaning over his. I almost said something. I keep thinking about that after. I almost called out or signaled a nearby crowd management officer. But then I thought, he's excited, he's not doing anything wrong, he's just leaning. And the address was going, and I had a job to do. I raised my camera. Personal account, Staff Sergeant Raymond Delaney continued. I picked him up at about 11 minutes before the token exchange. Male, middle-aged, civilian dress, camera. Right side of Section D, he was not exhibiting any indicators I would characterize as threatening in a conventional sense. He was excited. He was pushing toward the front. But excited people push toward the front at these events. That's why the barriers were there. What flagged him for me was the way he was looking at the Neurosi. Not at the ceremony. Not at the Sala or the Werk dignitaries on the platform. Specifically at the Neurosi military escort formation, and he was moving along the barrier toward the forward edge of the Neurosi perimeter, not toward the ceremonial center. I can't tell you it was a threat assessment. It wasn't. There was nothing that would have met a formal threshold. It was pattern recognition. Years of watching crowds, years of watching people, some part of my brain doing math that my conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. I flagged the position to Corporal Park via earpiece and adjusted my station 2 steps to the right to get a better angle. That was all I did. 2 steps, it shouldn't matter. Except that it did, eventually, because those 2 steps put me in the right place when everything happened. The Secretary General concluded his address at 13:41 hours. There was applause. The Sala ambassador, Tiras, responded with that hand gesture again, and the crowd reacted warmly. For a moment the energy in the plaza was extraordinary, this warm, almost disbelieving human joy at the reality of what was happening. 13 years from the Fermi signal to this, standing in the same space with beings from 7 different planets. The joy was real. I felt it, even at my post. It was hard not to. That was when the man in the commemorative jacket reached over the barrier. Segment 4, Build Tension. Recorded statement, Corporal Janine Park continued. It happened fast and slow at the same time. That's the only way I can describe it. I heard Sergeant Delaney's voice in my ear, Section D, forward position, civilian approach, and then I heard him start moving. He was already moving by the time I processed what he'd said. And then I looked to Section D and I could see the man. He had his camera out ahead of him, held over the barrier, and he was trying to get a close shot of the nearest Neurosi soldier, the forward right position in their formation, roughly 8 feet from the barrier. He was leaning over. His torso was past the top edge of the barrier. His feet were on our side. His upper body was in the perimeter. He wasn't threatening. He was enthusiastic. He wanted a close photo. He wanted a photo that nobody else had. I understood the impulse completely. The Neurosi soldier he was pointing the camera at was absolutely still. Compound eyes tracking. No external movement. I've watched the footage many times since. You cannot tell from the footage what the Neurosi soldier was experiencing. That's the terrifying thing. He looks the same in the 30 seconds before as he does in the 2 seconds immediately after. Whatever happened inside him during that interval is invisible to human observation. The address had ended. The plaza sound level was elevated. People were applauding, talking, shifting position. The translation pylons were cycling through the Werk processional tone again, doing some kind of ceremonial marker thing that the IDLO liaison team had told us meant the ceremony had reached its transition point. Everything was noise. And then the Neurosi soldier moved. Recorded statement, Gerald Finch, civilian witness, Section C, age 58. I was close. I was right there. I'd been holding my position on the barrier in Section C for about 2 hours at that point, so I had a really good view of everything on the pathway. The Neurosi soldiers had been there for most of the ceremony. And I had spent most of the ceremony trying not to stare at them, because the briefing materials we'd all been given said something like, avoid direct and extended eye contact with the Neurosi military escort, as this may be interpreted as a challenge posture. And I was taking that very seriously. But I watched what happened in Section D. The man with the camera leaned over and everything was fine, and then one of the Neurosi soldiers, the one at the front right of their formation, moved. It wasn't gradual. There was no build-up. He was still, and then he was not still, and the motion was, I don't have a word for it. It was very fast and very deliberate, and it covered the distance from his position to the barrier in what felt like less than a second. I'm going to say struck. That's the word that was in the news, and it's accurate in a clinical sense. He brought his hand, his primary right hand, since the Neurosi have 4 upper limbs down in a sharp downward arc, and made contact with the man's camera. Not the man, the camera. The camera flew out of the man's hand. It went up, arced, came down on the pathway side of the barrier, and hit the stone with a sound I could hear over the crowd noise. The lens shattered. The man stumbled back from the force of it. He didn't fall, but he stumbled, and when he recovered and looked up, the Neurosi soldier was standing directly at the barrier line, all 8 feet of him, and looking directly at the man with those compound amber eyes. And that was the moment. That was the moment when everything in the plaza just stopped. Recorded statement, Delilah Osaibansu continued. I got the shot on the motion. Pure reflex. My camera was up and I was shooting bursts, and the sequence caught the movement, the hand coming down, the camera going up, the man stumbling. But then I stopped shooting. Because everyone stopped. I've never been in a crowd of 3,000 people that went silent at the exact same moment. Not gradually, not the way noise fades at the end of a piece of music. I mean instantaneous. Like someone had cut the audio. 1 second applause, conversation, the hum of the translation pylons, and the next second nothing. Nothing at all. And in that nothing, you could hear the man's camera hitting the stone pathway. And you could hear, very faintly, the ambient sound of the Neurosi soldiers' armor making that slight resonant sound they make when they move, this low harmonic vibration. And you could hear the man's own breathing, amplified by the silence, frightened and fast. and then you could hear the sound of boots on stone. One set of boots, moving quickly and without hesitation. Everyone looked. I was already moving before the crowd went silent. I want to be precise about the sequence. The Neurosi soldier moved, I saw it, I was moving. The silence came while I was in motion. I didn't register it until later, listening to the recordings, because when you're moving to a position, you're not processing ambient sound the same way. You're processing the immediate tactical picture. The immediate tactical picture was this. A civilian had inadvertently entered a Neurosi sovereign perimeter. A Neurosi soldier had responded per their military protocol, which, by the compact ratified diplomatic agreement, they were lawfully entitled to do. The camera was destroyed. The civilian was unharmed. Within the framework of Neurosi military law, the incident was closed. The response had been proportional. The perimeter had been defended. There was no further obligation. Within the framework of what was happening in that plaza, in front of 3,000 human beings and multiple delegations, in front of cameras broadcasting to several 100,000 more, the incident was not closed. The Neurosi soldier was standing at the barrier line, looking directly at a frightened civilian, and the crowd was frozen, and the next 30 seconds were going to determine how this day would be remembered. I reached the barrier position in Section D at 13:47 hours. The Neurosi soldier was standing at the barrier, approximately 6 feet from the civilian, who had backed against the crowd. The soldier was completely still again, that stillness that looks like it could be anything. I positioned myself between them. Not confrontationally. I want to be very specific about my posture and my movements, because I understand that what happened was watched by a lot of people and interpreted in a lot of ways, and I want the record to be accurate. I positioned myself between them. I was at parade rest, not at attention, which is a posture that the liaison team had specifically designated as non-threatening in the context of human-to-Neurosi interaction. I was facing the Neurosi soldier. My hands were visible and loose. I did not reach for anything. I did not move toward the Neurosi soldier. I did not challenge or gesture or do anything that could have been read within Neurosi military protocol as an aggressive act. I stood there, and I looked him in the eye. The guidance said don't maintain, extended direct eye contact with the Neurosi military escort. I know. I'll tell you what I thought in those 3 or 4 seconds. I thought, whatever he's reading off me right now, it needs to be the clearest thing I've ever communicated in my life. Not threat, not submission, not apology, just presence. Just I am here, I see you, this space between us is held and I am not moving. There's a thing that happens sometimes when you've been in the military long enough, and you've stood enough hard posts, and you've been in enough rooms where the air was wrong, and someone had to decide what the next 3 seconds were going to look like. There's a thing that happens where everything gets very quiet in your own head, separate from whatever noise is around you, and you find a place that's just steady. I was in that place. I stayed in it. Recorded statement, Corporal Janine Park continued. I was watching from my position, and I've tried to describe what I felt in that moment, and I never quite get it right. The Neurosi soldier was enormous. They're enormous up close in a way that the briefing photos and the broadcast footage don't convey. He was 8 feet tall and broad in the way that things are broad when they've been engineered for it, not just grown, and he was standing at that barrier, and his compound eyes were looking at Sergeant Delaney, and Sergeant Delaney was looking back. And the crowd was just silent, 3,000 people not making a sound. I could hear my own heartbeat. The thing about the Neurosi that I kept thinking about, standing there, was the advisory note about stillness meaning stress. They get more still the higher the emotional register. Which means standing in front of one that has just done a thing and is now standing very, very still. There's no external indicator of where you are on the scale. You don't know if you're looking at neutral or you're looking at the precursor to something that happens very fast. Sergeant Delaney didn't flinch. I've been in the Corps for 7 years. I have never seen anyone hold position under pressure the way he held that position. He wasn't rigid. He wasn't frozen. He was just there, like the barrier was his and he'd been standing at it since before the plaza was built. And the Neurosi soldier looked at him. Really looked at him. Those compound eyes cover a wide field, but they can focus, and they were focused on Sergeant Delaney. And then something happened that I don't know how to categorize. The Neurosi soldier, very slowly, very deliberately, turned his head. Not his whole body, just his head. He turned it looking past Sergeant Delaney, and then he turned it back, and then he stepped backward, 1 step, back into his formation position. And he was still again. Recorded statement, Gerald Finch continued. I don't know how long the silence lasted. It felt like an hour, but it was probably about 15 seconds from when the camera hit the stone to when the Neurosi soldier stepped back. When he stepped back, there was this, not applause, not cheering, something else. People started breathing again, I think, all at once, and the breath coming out of 3,000 people at the same time made a sound. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a soft sound, almost like the sound a wave makes when it's receding, that low rush. And then somebody near me started crying, not loudly, just crying. And then more people started crying. I'm not ashamed to say I was one of them. Recorded statement, Ambassador Tira's solid delegation, via IDLO translation, submitted April 16, 2041. We have been asked to characterize what we observed from our position on the ceremonial platform. The interaction between the human guard and the Neurosi military officer has been discussed within our delegation at some length. I will share what I said to my colleagues in the immediate aftermath. I said, "This is interesting. This is a thing we have not seen before." The Neurosi have a concept. There is no direct translation into human language, but the closest approximation is something like the quality of a thing that does not need to prove its nature. A stone does not tell you it is heavy. It simply sits and you understand. A fire does not argue that it burns. It simply burns and you understand. What the human guard demonstrated, standing in that position, in that silence, is what the Neurosi call this quality. I do not know if the human guard was aware of the cultural weight of what he was doing. I suspect he was not, because humans in my observation rarely are when they are doing something admirable. They are usually thinking about something more immediate and practical. But the Neurosi soldier saw it. That is why he stepped back. Not because he was defeated. Not because he was threatened. Because the quality was there, undeniable in front of him. You cannot argue with a thing that simply is. Recorded statement, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb continued. I've been asked what I thought when I saw Sergeant Delaney move to that position. I'll be honest. In the first second, the first fraction of a second, I thought, he's going to make this worse. Not because I doubted him. I'd served with him for 3 years. I knew him. But the briefings had been very explicit about not escalating, not drawing the Neurosi military escort's focus. And here was my sergeant, walking directly into the sight line of an 8-foot alien soldier who had just destroyed a man's camera with his hand. And then I watched him stand there. And I thought, oh, okay. He's got it. I don't know how I knew. I'm not sure it's the kind of thing you can explain in a congressional testimony. It's the kind of knowledge that lives in your body, not your head. The way you know that someone who's been in the field long enough has a different quality to how they stand, even at rest. Something settled about it. He stood that post like he was made to stand it. And the crowd watched. And the Neurosi soldier stepped back. And the world changed. Segment 6, The Aftermath, Human Reactions. Recorded statement, Delilah Osaibansu continued. After the Neurosi soldier stepped back, There was a moment. I want to describe this carefully because I saw it from close range and I think it matters. Sergeant Delaney didn't move immediately. He waited. He held the position for maybe 3 more seconds after the Neurosi soldier stepped back, which sounds like nothing, but in that kind of silence, 3 seconds is measurable and present. He held it, and then he stepped back himself 1 step, and then he turned to check on the civilian man. The man was standing at the rear of the crowd section, looking shell-shocked. His jacket was fine. He was unharmed. His camera was in several pieces on the pathway. Sergeant Delaney picked up the camera pieces. Gently, he walked them back to the man and placed them in his hands, and I could see him saying something. I couldn't hear it over the translation pylons resuming and the crowd starting to exhale, but the man looked down at the broken pieces in his hands, and then he looked up at Sergeant Delaney, and he nodded. I got that shot too. That one didn't make the front pages. That one's just mine. Recorded statement, Mikkel Tremont, the man with the camera, age 53, retired civil engineer. I've been asked to give my account. I'm still embarrassed. I want to lead with that. I was foolish. I leaned over that barrier and I was foolish, and I understand that, and I would not do it again. What I remember from the actual moment, the Neurosi soldier moved, and it was like a door slamming in your face when you didn't know it was going to close. Fast and final and absolute. My camera was gone out of my hands before I fully understood that his hand had been in motion. And then I was looking up at him, and everything inside me just stopped. I was not brave in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I was terrified. My legs were unsteady and I stepped backward into the crowd and I couldn't make myself move farther than that. And then the sergeant was there. He didn't look at me. He looked at the Neurosi soldier, and something happened between them that I watched from maybe 6 feet away and that I still cannot fully describe. It wasn't a standoff. It was something more deliberate, more mutual, like 2 things recognizing each other across a very large distance. And then the soldier stepped back, and Sergeant Delaney turned and picked up my camera. He held it out to me and said, "I'll put this in my account because it's the kind of thing that seems small and is actually not small at all," he said. "You'll want the memory card. Most of these cameras, it's in the grip section, right here." And he showed me where it was, on the broken camera body. And then he said, "Your shots are probably still on there, if you find the right person to retrieve them." That's it, that's what he said. Nothing about what just happened, nothing heroic or big, just your memory card is probably fine. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think about it now, actually. There's something in it, about what it means to keep going, about how people who are steady don't make a ceremony out of it. They just find the next practical thing and do it. Official Briefing Document, IDLO, Internal Record, April 14, 2041, Evening Review. The Section D incident was formally reviewed by IDLO Security and the Compact Diplomatic Coordination Committee within 3 hours of the event. The Neurosi military escorts action was determined to be in full compliance with Compact Diplomatic Protocol. The civilian, Mr. Mikkel Tremont, had entered the designated sovereign perimeter, and the Neurosi response, physical removal of the instrument held by the civilian, was proportional and within the established parameters. Mr. Tremont was not the subject of any formal action. Sergeant Raymond Delaney's intervention was reviewed separately. The review panel included 2 human security assessors and, at the request of the Neurosi diplomatic party, 1 Neurosi cultural attaché. The Neurosi cultural attaché. This is noted in the record as unusual, as Neurosi attachés do not typically participate in human security reviews, reviewed the footage twice. The attaché's formal written response, translated by the IDLO Linguistic Division. The human guard's behavior demonstrated a quality our military culture designates by a term that may be translated as sovereign presence without declaration. This is a quality valued in Neurosi military tradition. Its presence in a non-Neurosi individual was noted by the escort soldier in question, and was the reason for his withdrawal. We wish this noted in the formal record. We also wish noted that the human guard's subsequent action in retrieving the civilian's broken device and returning it personally is consistent with a Neurosi concept of completing the circle of an action, acknowledging both the disruption and its resolution. He did not need to do this. He did it. This also was noted. The token exchange ceremony resumed approximately 40 minutes after the Section D incident. The Werk elder delegate, upon resuming the processional approach, paused at the point on the pathway adjacent to Sergeant Delaney's station. What happened next was not in the protocol. Personal account, Staff Sergeant Raymond Delaney continued. I don't fully know how to put this in a document. The Werk elder, I'd seen them from a distance. Everyone had. They're, I don't want to say imposing because that's the wrong feeling. They're old in a way that has presence. Not just physically large, old in a way that feels like standing next to a mountain, not threatening, just very, very there. The elder paused at my station. My instinct was to look forward, not to make eye contact, not to do anything that required a protocol I didn't have. But the elder stopped, and the processional stopped with him, and the crowd had started recovering from the silence of the incident. And now it went quiet again, for different reasons. And the elder reached out. He placed his hand, his primary hand, large and pale gray, fingers very long, on my shoulder. Very briefly, a second, less than a second. And then he withdrew it and continued the processional. The IDLO liaison team confirmed for me later what the gesture meant in Werk culture. I'm going to include it in this account not because I think it makes me special, I don't, but because I think it's the kind of thing that should be on record. In Werk culture, that gesture is given by elders to members of the community who have done something that upholds what they call the fundamental agreement, not any specific contract or treaty. The fundamental agreement between sentient beings, the one that says, in the same space, at the same time, we acknowledge that neither of us is going to make the other's existence worse by accident or impulse. We hold the space. The Werk elder touched my shoulder because, in his cultural framework, I had upheld that agreement. I stood at my post for the rest of the ceremony. My shoulder was warm for a long time after. Recorded statement, Dr. Amara Solis Nakamura, Lead Cultural Analyst, IDLO Human Integration Division. The events of April 14th have been analyzed extensively in the weeks since. I want to offer some context that I think is missing from most of the coverage. What happened in Section D was not an anomaly. It was not a near disaster. It was, if we look at it carefully, an almost perfect demonstration of the reason the human species was admitted to provisional member status in the first place. The Galactic Compact has encountered many species in its history. It has encountered species that are larger, faster, more technologically advanced, longer-lived, and in some cases biologically superior to humans by almost every conventional measure. The question the Compact asks when evaluating a species for membership is not, are they powerful? Power is common. It is not even particularly interesting. The question the Compact asks is, are they present? Presence, in the way the Compact uses the concept, means something specific. It means the capacity to be fully in a moment of difficulty without either collapsing into it or escaping from it. To stand in the middle of something hard and stay in contact with it. To not flinch, and not attack, and not run, and not make it about yourself, but to hold the situation with enough steadiness that the situation itself can resolve. We tend to think of this as an individual quality. We call it composure, or courage, or professionalism. The Compact considers it a species characteristic. They are watching whether individuals can demonstrate it, but they are using those demonstrations to evaluate the species as a whole. Sergeant Delaney didn't know he was being evaluated in this way. I genuinely believe that. He was doing his job. But the Verk elder who touched his shoulder, the Neurosi soldier who stepped back, the Sala ambassador who, and this is in the footage, though it's easy to miss, briefly inclined his head in Sergeant Delaney's direction from the ceremonial platform about 90 seconds after the incident. They all registered the same thing. This is what these humans do. Given a moment of genuine difficulty, they hold. That changes how the compact will relate to the human species for the next several centuries. It started with one Marine standing at a barrier in the afternoon sun. Recorded statement, Corporal Janine Park continued. After the ceremony, after the reception period, after everything had wound down and the delegations had been escorted to the residential complex and the plaza was being cleared, there was a point where the detail was standing down in stages, and a group of us ended up in the staging area at the north end of the plaza. Sergeant Delaney was there. He was out of his formal posture by then, not off-duty exactly but no longer actively on post, and he was sitting on a low equipment case and eating from a ration pack, which I thought was very funny given everything. Someone asked him, one of the younger corporals, maybe 19 years old, first major deployment, they asked him, "How do you do that? How do you just stand there like that?" And Sergeant Delaney looked at them for a moment, chewing. He said, "Stand where?" And the corporal said, "In front of them, when everybody's watching, how do you not freeze?" And Sergeant Delaney said, "You've already decided what you're going to do before you get there. You decided at 500 in the briefing. You decided every time you read the protocols. You decided at home if you're doing it right. By the time you're standing at the post, the decision is already made. You're not doing anything new. You're just doing what you already decided." He ate some more. Then he said, "The freezing comes from thinking you still have to decide when you're already there. You've already decided. You just have to show up to the thing you decided." The corporal nodded like they were taking notes. I think about that a lot. I went back to the plaza the next morning. Not for any official reason. The permits were day-specific and mine had expired. I wanted to stand there, in the open space when there were no crowds, just look at the place where it happened. The pathway was clean. The liaison team had cleared everything. You couldn't tell anything had happened. The stone was smooth and pale, and the translation pylons were quiet. They hum at a low level even when inactive, and the morning light was coming in at a low angle and making the whole place look slightly unreal. I stood at the barrier in Section D. I thought about what I almost made into a disaster. I thought about the Neurosi soldier's hand, how fast it was, how final, how I hadn't even seen it coming. I thought about what might have happened if things had gone differently. If the crowd had panicked, if the Neurosi escort had read the crowd panic as a threat, if the situation had escalated the way situations can escalate when everyone is frightened and nobody knows the rules. I thought about Sergeant Delaney walking into all of that and just standing there. I had my memory card in my pocket. A friend of mine who does photo restoration had retrieved the files from it the night before. Most of the shots were fine. The burst sequence of the incident came out clearly. The shots I'd taken of the ceremony, of the delegations, of the crowd, all fine. The last shot on the card before my camera was destroyed was the Neurosi soldier moving. I'd been shooting on reflex, following the motion of the ceremony, and I'd caught the beginning of his movement toward the barrier. In the shot, you can't see the soldier's face clearly, the angle is wrong, but you can see the motion, the arm beginning to arc downward. And in the right edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, you can see a figure moving. Military jacket, steady posture, already in motion. I didn't even know I'd caught it. I looked at that edge of the frame for a long time. That's what he looked like, when he was already doing the thing he'd already decided. Just a figure, slightly out of focus, moving in the right direction. Media Analysis Summary, IDLO Communications Division, Internal Document, April 20th, 2041. The broadcast of the Grand Integration Ceremony was the most-watched live event in recorded human history, with a peak concurrent viewership of 4.1 billion across all platforms. The Section D incident was captured by 14 separate camera positions and 2 private broadcast drones operating under press credentials. The incident footage was edited and distributed within minutes by every major news organization on the planet. Viewership response analysis, compiled from social media monitoring and survey data collected in the 72 hours following the event. Primary emotional responses cited by viewers: awe 61%, relief 57%, pride 44%, fear in retrospect 39%, a feeling I don't have a word for 22%. The photograph taken by Ms. Delilah Osaibansu, specifically the frame capturing Sergeant Delaney's position between the civilian and the Neurosi soldier, taken approximately 4 seconds after the soldier stepped back, became the most shared single image in the history of any social media platform. It depicts in left-to-right arrangement the crowd, the low barrier, Sergeant Delaney's back, the empty space where the confrontation occurred, and the Neurosi soldier at his formation position, restored to stillness. The image is notable for what it does not show. There is no confrontation visible. The crisis is over. What is visible is its absence, the space that is now quiet, and the human figure that stands at the edge of it. Multiple art critics, writing in the days following, used the phrase, the shape of presence. Several said it was the most important photograph taken in the 21st century. Ms. Osaibansu has declined all interview requests to date. They keep asking me what I was thinking when I took the shot. The honest answer is, I wasn't thinking. I was just shooting. That's what you do when you're a photojournalist. You're not composing. You're following the moment and hoping your eye and the camera agree about what matters. When I looked at the shot later, I understood what it had caught. It's a photograph of quiet. After everything, the ceremony, the silence, the confrontation, the crowd holding its breath, it's a photograph of the quiet that came after. And the thing that made the quiet possible is standing in it with his back to the camera. I've been asked what the story is in my view, as someone who was there. I'll tell you what I think. I don't think the story is about the alien. The alien did exactly what his culture and his training told him to do, and within his framework it was right. I'm not criticizing him. The camera was in the perimeter. He responded. I don't think the story is about the man with the camera. He was foolish for a moment, but he was foolish in the most human way possible. He was excited. He wanted to be close to something amazing, and he forgot the rules. That's not a villain story. That's a human story. I think the story is about the space. What it takes to hold a space. What it takes to stand in the middle of something and be the thing that makes the next moment possible instead of impossible. What it takes to walk toward instead of away when everything in the situation is uncertain and loud and not yet decided. Sergeant Delaney held that space. And the world, 3,000 people in a plaza, 4 billion people watching, 7 species of sentient beings seeing what we're capable of, the world had 5 seconds of silence and then it breathed. That's the story. That's always been the story. Final segment, Coda and Resolution. Official Statement, Sergeant Raymond Delaney, USMC, prepared at the request of the Congressional Review Board to be read into the official record. I've been asked to provide a concluding statement for the record. I'll keep it brief. I want to acknowledge Corporal Park and the other members of the Central Pathway Detail, who held their posts during the Section D incident without flinching, without breaking formation, and without doing anything that would have complicated the situation. They're not in the photographs. They should be in this record. I want to acknowledge Mr. Tremont, who submitted himself voluntarily to this review process despite having no obligation to do so. He made a mistake. He stood in the middle of the consequences of it with more dignity than a lot of people would have. That matters. I want to say something about the HFY soldier. The briefings told me he would be difficult to read. They were right. But looking back at the moment, and I've had time to look back, to think about what I felt in those seconds, I think the difficult to read is not absence. I think there's something there that I can't access with the sensory equipment I was born with, but that doesn't mean it's empty. When he stepped back, it wasn't defeat. I don't know exactly what it was, but I've come to believe it was something like acknowledgement. Two very different things, looking at each other across a barrier, and both of them finding something on the other side that made continued conflict unnecessary. I don't know what that experience is for a HFY soldier. I probably never will. But I know what it felt like from my side. It felt like meeting someone. Not an alien, not a threat, not a category from a briefing packet. Someone. That's the only thing I've got that might be worth putting in a congressional record. Everything else about that day is in the footage and in the testimony and in the photograph that everybody's already seen. But that, the thing in the 2 seconds before he stepped back, that's mine, and I'm putting it here. Two very different things, looking at each other. Finding something. That's how it starts, I think. That's how all of it starts.